All right, welcome back, you guys. Hope you guys had a wonderful weekend and a happy Easter. The plan for today is to cover the content for chapter 2, which, as it turns out, there's very little content to go over, but nonetheless, very important content. So, even though there won't be a lot going on today, I do ask that you are on your toes about this material that we will go over today. Very basic material, but fundamental for the upcoming chapters that we will be discussing in the course. So at this point, I ask that if there are any questions regarding the material that I will be going over today, that you please just shoot me an email and I will be gladly to answer any questions related to this. All right, so let's go ahead and knock down the basics for test and measurement. And let's jump right into chapter 2. All right, so first of all, let's start with what a variable is. I think at this point in your academic careers, it is something that you may have been asked in previous courses, but we'll go ahead and reiterate yet again. A variable is anything that varies or changes. Of course, there would be a spelling error in one of my PowerPoints here, so just go ahead and bear with me as I change that really quick. So as I was saying, anything that varies or changes. So that can include eye color, height, weight, right? There are different types of eye color. So blue, hazel, black, green, brown, and so on and so forth. Height, so people vary in height. So we have anywhere from 5'1", 4'9", 6'2", 5'7", and so on and so forth. So yet another characteristic that varies. Weight, right? So there are different types of weight. So, infants to children, to younger adults, to adults, right? Weight varies across these different age groups. So anywhere from, 20 pounds to 50 pounds to 180 pounds, and so on and so forth. So weight is yet another characteristic that varies as well. Intelligence. So if you've ever taken an IQ test, you know that an IQ test has a mean of 100. So on average, people tend to score around 100, right? So this may include anywhere from 85 to 90 to 105 to 120, and so on and so forth. Self-esteem, depending on how you measure it. Traditionally, self-esteem is measured via surveys. So it could be that your total score on a self-esteem survey can range from 1 to 100. So higher scores indicating higher levels of self-esteem, meaning that somebody who scores a 60 has lower self-esteem than someone who scores an 85, for example. But the point here is that we can have different quantities of self-esteem. Self-esteem changes, okay? Anxiety does so as well, and so on and so forth. So just to start off the chapter today, it is important to know that a variable is anything that changes in quantity. Things that do not change or do not take on different levels are called constants, okay? So anything that does not change in level or quantity is referred to as a constant, not a variable. In psychology, we are interested in things that change. Moreover, explaining why these changes occur. For example, self-esteem. Why does self-esteem maybe increase or decrease throughout teenhood? What are the factors that predict changes in self-esteem? Maybe it is a new social context from transitioning from elementary to junior high school or middle school, right? Maybe there are social related variables that produce changes in self-esteem, right? So at the end of the day, really as psychologists, what we're interested in studying is or are changes in behavior. In order to study changes, we have to quantify them and create varying levels of these constructs. All right. Moving forward to another example. of another concept, which has to do with assessing the completeness of a construct. For those of you who might have had 310 already or 311, what I'm going to talk about now is the idea or the concept of construct validity, meaning how well are we assessing any given construct that we are interested in studying. Moreover, by what measures are we trying to assess that construct? So here the example that I have is achievement, dead in the center of this conceptual model here. How are we trying to get at achievement? By what instruments or indices are we trying to assess this construct of achievement? Well, the two examples that I have here is, first of all, GPA. So maybe we think that achievement should be assessed by one's level or GPA score. Okay. Another way that we can try and tap into this construct of achievement is by assessing one's classroom tests. So whether people perform higher on GPA or higher on these classroom tests might be indicative of how much they are achieving, but maybe not. It all depends on how we define achievement. Maybe achievement to some of you is extracurricular activities. Maybe it's how involved a student is with the community. As you see, that is not here. So maybe for that definition of achievement, we may not be getting at what we really mean by achievement by using GPA scores or classroom tests. Or maybe some of you think that, GPA is important. Classroom tests are also important, but we are missing some key indicators here, such as extracurricular involvement, and maybe some other forms of achievement that may not be present here. But you see the issues here. Achievement can be defined differently, just like any other construct in the behavioral sciences. And just like we can have multiple definitions of different constructs, the definitions themselves lead to how one will measure that given construct. Measurement is crucial, and measurement is really defined and driven by the way one defines different constructs. So that's the whole point of this model here, is to illustrate that we can measure achievement, but that measurement is completely driven by how we define that construct. Okay, so moving forward to the meat of this chapter here, we will go ahead and talk about levels of measurement. Okay, maybe some of you by now are tired of talking about levels of measurement. It seems that it is a reoccurring concept in the psychology or human development courses. But the truth of the matter is that these levels of measurement really pave the way for how we study variables and how we conduct science. So let's go ahead and talk about the first level of measurement, which is the nominal level. Nominal variables are used to categorize or label characteristics. They are serving the purpose of grouping individuals into separate dimensions. So nominal really does mean to name or classify individuals into separate categories. The example that I have here is the Republican versus the Democratic political parties. Whether you belong to the Republican Party or whether you belong to the Democratic Party or any other third party that might exist, the sole purpose of a nominal variable is just to say you belong in group A and you belong in group B or group C. All we know at this point is that individuals differ in their category membership, and that is it. That is all we know. Qualitatively, we know that the Republican Party might represent some set of core values. The Democratic Party might represent a separate set of core values. So we know that there are qualitative differences between the Republican and Democratic Party. But quantitatively, being Republican or being Democratic, there is no difference. So we can assign a 1 to the Republican Party and a 2 to the Democratic Party. But these classifications of 1 versus 2 do not mean anything in terms of one being better than the other, one being more correct than the other, and so on and so forth. They are simply numbers assigned to these groups to create the idea that there are two separate groups. Okay, so that is the nominal variable. Gives you the least amount of information when trying to study any given variable within the behavioral sciences. All right, as we progress through each level of measurement, the more information we will be able to obtain as we move up in the hierarchy of levels of measurement. All right, moving on to the second, we refer to this as the ordinal variable. Ordinal signifies order, meaning that we are able to rank variables. We are able to rank levels of a variable. Okay, the example that I have here can be the results of a race. So for example, we have a first place finisher, a second place finisher, or a third place finisher. Now, not only are there groups, right? So there's the first place, the second place, and the third place group. But now we know that one, group can stand above another group. Okay, so the first place group stands above the second place group, and the second place group can stand above the third place group. So now we have ranked the levels of any given variable. Now we can say there is a better group versus a not so good group, and so on and so forth. So now we have information about positioning, right? So now we have added an extra layer of information to our study by being able to add ordinal variables, right? Because remember beforehand, with nominal variables, all we knew is that there are separate categories. That is it, right? Qualitatively, we were aware of the fact that there are separate groups. However, now by moving up in the hierarchy, now we know not only that there are separate groups, but that these groups can fall above or beneath each other, depending on what you're using to differentiate between the different groups. Here we are talking about a race, so it might be that the first place was fastest, then the second place was fastest than the third place, and the third place was slowest in the overall outcome of the race. So now we have information about better versus worse, faster versus slower, and so on and so forth. However, one of the critical disadvantages of the ordinal variable is that we don't know how much better or how worse. Yes, we know that maybe Tommy, right, might have came first in the race, and then that Tommy might have been faster, okay, than Jimmy, and Jimmy was faster than Johnny, okay, but we don't know how much faster Tommy was than Jimmy and how much faster Jimmy was than Johnny, right? We have no idea about the intervals between the different finishes, right? So to gain information about how much information falls in between these levels, we have to adopt the interval level of measurement. Now, with this level of measurement, we gain a huge amount of information, far superior than its predecessors of the nominal and ordinal variables. With the interval level of measurement, now we can assign values of equal intervals between the different categories. So now the interval level of measurement possesses all of the features of the ordinal variable and all of the features of the nominal variable. That is a very important concept for you guys to know as we talk about these levels of measurement, that each successive level of measurement possesses the qualities and all of the qualities of its predecessors. Okay, so as we move up in the chain, just know that each successive level of measurement contains all of the features possessed by the ones that came beforehand. Okay, so now with the interval level of measurement, we have information about how much better or how much faster, how much slower individuals are, right? Whatever trait or quality it is that you want to insert in any of those given examples. The example here can be spelling abilities, right? So we know that if on a spelling test that ranges from 1 to 10, we know that the distance between 7 and 8, okay, is the same as the distance between 9 and 10. Okay, so now we have information about how much better, right? A person who scored that an 8, how much better they are than a person who scored a 7, right? It would be by a 1-point difference, okay? Compared to if we were comparing individuals in which one scored a 5 and one scored a 9. Now we have information about how much more, right, correct the person was who scored a 9 over the person who scored a 5, right? There was a 4-point difference in spelling ability, okay? However, the disadvantage of the interval level of measurement is that there is no true 0 point, meaning, okay, that is there really a 0 level of ability, okay? Even if you score, right, a 0 on a spelling test, does that really mean that you have no spelling ability whatsoever? Not really, right? So to be able to establish and gain information about true 0 points, okay, we then get to the highest level of measurement, the ratio scale. Here, the ratio scale provides us with the most amount of information. And like I've reiterated before, it possesses the characteristics or features of every other level of measurement before this one. It possesses all of the features of the interval scale, possesses all of the features of the ordinal scale, and possesses all of the features of the nominal scale. The ratio level of measurement, because it can accommodate for complex level of information, thereby giving you the most amount of information, we can do more with ratio scales than we can with interval, ordinal, or nominal. Okay, statistically, having ratio scales allows you to engage in more statistical analyses compared to the previous levels of measurement. All right. The feature that really sets apart the ratio level of measurement from the interval level of measurement is the fact that ratio scales have true zeros. Okay, there is a true 0 feature, meaning that there can be a complete absence of an attribute. Okay, so for example, the absence of light. You can see that you can be in a completely dark room in which there is literally or physically no light. The absence of reaction time. So in our studies, okay, in cognition, there are times where people simply do not respond. Okay, people that do not respond to a given stimulus have a reaction time of 0. Okay, that truly signifies that there was no time associated with that response because there was an absence of a response. All right, absence of weight, right? If you leave a scale in your room, okay, you just lay that on the floor, the weight at that point is 0, right? The moment you or somebody else steps on that scale, right, we see an increase in the value of weight, which could be pounds, could be kilograms, or whatever other form of measurement you decide to think about. The point is that the moment the person steps off the scale, the pounds, right, or the kilograms now reduce down to 0, indicating that there is truly an absence of weight at that given point. Okay. Now, here's an interesting question. In the behavioral sciences, is there an attribute that can be truly non-existent? Okay. The question has different answers depending on who you're talking to. Okay. To the author in the book, okay, in the behavioral sciences, there is no behavior that is exactly 0, or there is no behavior that is truly absent. Okay, the examples that the author of the textbook brings up is intelligence and spelling. So the intelligence example, okay, the author states, can somebody truly have an intelligence of 0, or can there be truly an absence of intelligence? Then the author goes on to state, if any one of us would take an IQ test in Russian, okay, it is very possible that we might get a score of 0, okay, and not because we truly don't have any intelligence, but because we could not understand the questions on the IQ test. Therefore, a score of 0 on a Russian IQ test would not mean that we have 0 intelligence, right? What it means is that we did not take the appropriate test that would correctly and accurately measure our true level of intelligence. Okay. Spelling is the same way. Scoring a 0 on a spelling test does not mean that you have 0 spelling ability. It probably means that you just could not spell the 10 words that were provided to you. Okay, but you probably could spell other words that were not on the spelling test. Okay, so you see the point here. However, I brought up an earlier example in which there could be truly a non-existent trait. This non-existent trait is frequently studied in psychology, and that is reaction time. Okay, reaction time to me and to this class will be an exception of a behavior that could be studied via ratio scales. Okay, reaction time has a true 0 point. There are instances in which people simply do not respond, and that truly consists the absence of a response, right? So again, the answer to the question depends on who you're talking to for this class. I just want you to know that there is one exception to that general idea or that general feeling in which nothing in behavioral sciences can be truly ratio. I want you to know that there are a few exceptions to that, and there are things in psychology, in different areas of psychology, that we can consider to be ratio scales. Okay, but this simply means that I don't completely disagree with the author. It just means that there are exceptions out there, just like in any other field. Okay, so a quick summary. Here is a table that is in your textbook. I'd like you just to go ahead and look over it. It asks questions. Happy faces indicate that that is present in that given level of measurement. Sad faces means that that feature is not present in that given level of measurement. So just go ahead and go over those. I think that this table does a really good job of summarizing what we need to know about each level of measurement in terms of strengths and weaknesses. All right, so what does this all mean? Why should any of this matter? Okay, the reality is that levels of measurement pave the way for the amount of information we can draw from a study. The conclusions that we can make, the interpretations that we can make about any given study that we conduct as a behavioral scientist is ultimately dependent in the basic concept of level of measurement. If we limit ourselves to nominal or ordinal variables from the get-go, from the moment we conceptualize the study, we run the study, write up the paper, we can only make limited conclusions, limited complications about those variables because we limited ourselves to using nominal or ordinal variables, right? And as we saw before, nominal variables are very limited in what we can say about them, just like ordinal variables are as well, okay? So if you can increase in the amount of information that you can obtain from study, please do so. If you can default to a ratio scale, if you can default to an interval scale, please do so, because that will allow you to draw the most amount of information that you can to then be able to make the best conclusions and interpretations possible. Okay, so here on the right, we see that the levels of measurement increase on the dimensions of complexity from low to high, and on the dimension of precision from low to high. Nominal scales have low complexity, low precision. Interval scales have higher complexity, higher precision, and ratio scales have the highest level of complexity in addition to the highest level of precision. All right, so just know that as we get higher in terms of the levels of measurement, okay, we increase in complexity and we increase in precision. All right. So now, to wrap up the chapter, there are a few general implications and conclusions that we can draw. First of all, what we measure as behavioral scientists always falls under any of the 4 levels of measurement, whether it's a nominal variable that we're interested in, an interval variable that we're interested in, an ordinal variable that we're interested in, or ultimately a ratio variable that we're interested in. Any given behavior that as scientists we decide to study has to fall and will fall under any of these 4 categories. Second, each successive level of measurement contains the features of all the previous levels. Okay, we've heard that throughout this chapter, so by now that should be ingrained. Moving on, the more precise the measure, okay, the greater precision, the closer you will be to assessing the construct of interest. This is very important. Definitions start from the moment we define the measure. Okay? The more precise we get at a measure, the closer we will be able to assess the construct of interest. Okay? And lastly, ordinal variables can be treated as interval variables, but there are critical limitations to doing that or for interpreting those. All right? So just keep these general conclusions in mind. Okay? I have to say that there will be an online activity, our first online activity posted today, shortly after this lecture. From the moment that I post it, you will have 48 hours to complete the online activity. If you have any questions, just go ahead and please email me. Other than that, that is it for today. I hope that you guys are able to sort of sift through the material and gain a greater understanding of what I discussed. If not, please email me. I will be in touch with you shortly. Okay? Have a good rest of your day, and thanks, guys.